Whether you're a seasoned gamer or a newcomer to the gaming world, chances are good that there are genres or types of games that you are less familiar with. Over the nearly 50 years of video gaming history, so many different types of games have been created, and so many variations and even fusions of two or more genres that it can be quite confusing trying to categorize your favorite game or understand exactly what to expect when trying a new genre for the first time. To make things worse, many games are hotly debated within the gaming community, and even individual games within a series can stray from the typical format and cross genres. In this series of videos, I will attempt to define the most common terms, but I will leave it up to you to decide how your favorite game fits into them. One of the biggest genre debates, is Zelda an RPG, has been argued in playgrounds and living rooms since the 1980s, and still there are valid points to be made both for and against this debate. To really come to a conclusion on this debate and others in true For Dummies fashion, we need to define exactly what each major genre is, what differentiates them, and list some well-known examples you may be familiar with. Going back to the Zelda debate, let's start by defining an RPG, one of the most argued about genres in all of gaming. RPG. What is an RPG? RPG stands for role-playing game. Many argue that the name implies that any game where you assume the role of a character within the game must be a role-playing game, right? Right? Well, by that definition, almost every game would be an RPG. Let's try to narrow it down, shall we? The history of RPGs predate video games entirely and were made popular in the 70s and 80s by games such as the popular tabletop game Dungeons & Dragons. In D&D, you design a character starting with several different archetypes and adding skills and attributes through rolls of the dice. You then take that character on an adventure through magical worlds where you will take turns meeting challenges that you must overcome with your wit and by rolling the dice to decide how your character will interact with each new situation. One of the key systems in an RPG is choice, the ability to customize your character, and the ability for your character to evolve and become stronger as he, or she, or it overcome challenges and gain more experience. The earliest role-playing games on computers tried to emulate this, and by the late 1980s there was a definite formula to RPG games. Today, and indeed almost since the beginning, RPGs can be divided into a couple of main categories. Western RPGs, sometimes referred to as CRPGs or computer RPGs, and JRPGs or Japanese role-playing games. Without getting too technical about the differences, Western RPGs are usually made by American development companies, famous examples being games like Bethesda's Skyrim, the most popular of the Elder Scrolls series, or CD Projekt Red's The Witcher series. These games tend to have expansive worlds, a rich story, and a wealth of quests and activities to keep you engaged in the game for hundreds of hours. JRPGs, like the Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest series, tend to have a more stylized anime art style, although not always, and were identified in the early years by turn-based combat and complex skill progression and battle mechanics. Today, all games, at least the big ones, seem to be becoming more and more like each other, so the differences are less obvious, but it is safe to say that the basics of any RPG, with some arguable exceptions, are character customization, character progression or leveling up, and some level of control on how you build your character to reflect your preferred playstyle. Generally, a fair bit of inventory management is also involved, and that may include a crafting system to upgrade weapons and items or build entirely new ones. Alright, let's move on to the next and probably the most popular and easily recognizable genre, and that is platformers. It would be natural to assume that a platforming game would include platforms, right? Well, back in the day, they certainly did. Think back to the earliest Mario games and other mascot games from the 80s, and you won't have to look hard to find a platform to jump on. The limitations of early gaming hardware made it difficult to build realistic and natural environments, and even the controllers had limitations, often only being able to direct your character in 4 or 8 directions. Mario jumps onto bricks floating in midair or onto pipes spaced between large chasms. This mechanic is where the term platformer came from, but it's used in a much broader sense to describe a pretty large and diverse genre of games. Platform games can be loosely divided into 2D and 3D platformers, with some variants being 2.5D. Let me explain. You're probably familiar with Mario, so we'll use him as an example. Mario 1, 2, and 3 on the NES, along with Super Mario World on the Super Nintendo, are 2D platformers. In these games, you move Mario from left to right across the screen, avoiding obstacles and either avoiding or killing enemies. There is an emphasis on the skill of navigating the levels without dying. This requires precise control and timing. A 3D platformer takes the same idea and moves it into 3 dimensions, meaning you don't just move from left to right, but now the camera is behind the character and you have a full range of motion, left, right, forward, back, and theoretically up and down. The concept of platforms still exists in some 3D platformers, but in many cases, as technology improved, your character would be navigating more realistic environments, running up a hill, around a corner, and maybe jumping over a fence, say like in Mario 64 or more recently Mario Odyssey. Again, the emphasis is on navigating the environment and avoiding hazards while completing whatever objectives there may be. 2.5D is kind of a misnomer that doesn't really exist, but it's a term used to describe a 2D game with some depth and the ability to interact with the background or move toward or away from the camera while still being viewed from a 2D perspective. Kirby Planet Robobot on the 3DS is a great example of this, as is to some degree much of the Crash Bandicoot series, which is often presented in 3D but with forced perspectives that make it feel like a 2D game in a 3D space. Alright, let's move on to racing games, another very popular genre that you think you probably understand. Racing games might seem like the most obvious of the major genres, and on the surface, it is. At its core, you compete against other players, real or AI, to see who can get to the finish line first. Generally, this includes some kind of vehicle, whether a sports car, a go-kart, or even a spaceship, and most racing games have tracks or predetermined sections of roads that you race on. But you may not have known that all racing games are broken down into 2 major categories: arcade and simulation. A simulation game is exactly that. Think Gran Turismo or the F1 series. You use realistic cars, you usually race on real racetracks or in realistic environments, and most importantly, the physics are tuned to be as realistic to real driving conditions as possible. Often you can upgrade or customize your cars, and those changes will make real differences in how your car performs, either for better or for worse. In an arcade racer, the physics are much more forgiving. Cars stick on the track better, and the focus is more on fun and thrills than a simulation. Arcade games like the Cruisin' series or even Forza Horizon are about high speed, flashy tricks, drifting, and other high score related features, and tend to be more flashy visually. They also tend to be much more accessible at the beginning, but quite hard to master. Now here's a genre you might be a little bit confused about. The term gets thrown around all the time, and no, I'm not talking about the famous YouTuber Woodhawker. Beatemups. Beatemups sound obvious, right? You beat people up. Well, yeah, that could apply to virtually every game with combat. Beat-em-ups have a specific type of combat that some people love and many people do not. This kind of game was pioneered in the arcade in the 1980s as a type of pick-up-and-play experience that anyone could grasp, but few could master. Because of this history, many, if not most, beat-em-ups are co-op multiplayer. They have simple controls and were originally a 2D affair. Your character uses punches and kicks and often combos achieved by specific sequences of button presses to unleash more powerful attacks. Think of games like Sega's Streets of Rage series, or most of the Ninja Turtles early games like TMNT 2, the arcade game on the NES. Beat-em-ups can also exist in 3D and are often confused with, or even intentionally combined with, the hack and slash genre. Beat-em-ups can have weapons, sometimes temporary pickups, sometimes unique to the character you are playing, but in the case of hack and slash, you pretty much always have a weapon. In either 2D or 3D, beat-em-ups are all about timing your attacks and evading the attacks of the enemies. Enemies often attack in predictable patterns, and you have to learn those patterns to reduce the damage you take and get farther in the game. So sticking with the high action format, let's talk about Musou games. Musou games, also sometimes referred to as Warriors games, are a type of hack and slash game identified by having hundreds or thousands of enemies on screen that you slash your way through. Your character, even at the start of the game is incredibly powerful and has access to special moves and power-ups that can allow you to mow down wave after wave of enemies in a very satisfying way. These games were popularized in the PS2 era with the Dynasty Warriors franchise, hence the Warriors nickname, and continue to be made popular today with titles like Hyrule Warriors and Fire Emblem Warriors on the Nintendo Switch. This type of combat, like with Beatemups, is easy to pick up and play, but gets more complex and difficult throughout the game. Generally, Warriors games are pretty approachable though when compared to the often more complex combat of hack-and-slash games like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta. And of course, we've talked about hack-and-slash games so much. Hack-and-slash games, like the aforementioned Bayonetta and Devil May Cry, are most often 3D games categorized by fast-paced, frantic combat with flashy special moves. The combat usually involves melee weapons, but can also have projectiles too. Winning in a hack-and-slash is dependent on knowing how and when to unleash these special moves, especially in boss fights, which the genre is well known for. Combat is often quite complex, involving many different buttons and combinations of buttons. Later in the game, especially on harder difficulties, hack-and-slash games can require quite a bit of skill to beat. More recently, the hack-and-slash genre has been increasingly mixing with JRPGs in a variant known as Action RPG. There's actually two types of Action RPGs, we will discuss that later, but games such as the recent port of Nier Automata are ARPGs, with fast-paced, combo-heavy combat in an RPG setting with RPG leveling mechanics. Now let's move on to one of my favorite genres, simulation games. Simulation games broadly cover virtually every type of activity in both real and imaginary life. There are two major types of sim games: situational sims, where you literally simulate any activity, and farming and crafting sims. Situational sims, like the recently popular 2022 game Power Wash Simulator, is exactly what it sounds like. You operate a virtual pressure washer and clean anything from bicycles to factories. If you want to simulate running a restaurant, operating a theme park, managing an entire system of railroads, or even pretend to be a goat, there's a simulator for that. There is a pretty broad range of realism in these games, running the gamut from something like Microsoft Flight Simulator, which has virtually no game elements and strives to have a completely realistic simulation of flying various aircraft, to something cute and silly like The Sims 4. Games like The Sims combine elements of life sims, sending your character to work, earning money, sending them on dates, or even getting married, while also allowing huge flexibility in elements of home decor, fashion, and even city planning. Probably the most popular subgenre of Sims as a whole, though, are farming sims, or games that incorporate farming and crafting systems. The indie scene seems to love the farming genre, and there are literally dozens of different variations on these games, some with combat and RPG mechanics, some with life sim elements like dating and marriage, and some, like Graveyard Keeper, that trade the vegetables for corpses and have you upgrading headstones and exploring necromancy. Crafting, cooking, and activities like fishing and mining are also common activities in most of these games. The vast majority of farming sims are structured differently from situational sims because they are intentionally designed to be played in short bursts over months or years. They are usually on an accelerated day and night cycle that lasts several minutes per in-game day, and you must accomplish your daily tasks and then move on to the next day. This makes farming sims very attractive to a more casual audience who may want to play a game for 30 minutes here and there versus spending multiple hours in one gaming session. If you'd like to know more about game genres, like what the hell is an MMORPG or a shmup, make sure to subscribe and follow the channel for the next episode in the series, coming soon. Thanks so much for watching. Thanks for subscribing. Stay classy.